You know, in the early 20th century, Europe seemed like it was on top of the world. It was this continent of sprawling empires, huge ambitions, and incredible progress. But just beneath that shiny surface, something else was happening. The gears of a massive, continent-wide conflict were slowly but surely grinding into place. This is the story of how Europe turned into a giant powder keg, just waiting for a single spark.
So that brings up a huge question, right? How does an entire continent actually get ready for war? I mean, something that massive doesn't just happen overnight. It starts with lines being drawn in the sand, with old rivalries heating up, and with this slow, creeping buildup of suspicion. So let's dive in and see exactly how Europe got to that dangerous point.
So, first you've got to understand how the continent was splitting apart. Europe was basically organizing itself into two massive competing teams. And this whole process, believe it or not, kicked off because one country had a very, very specific goal in mind.
And here it is. It's a simple but incredibly powerful idea. The whole tangled web of alliances that would eventually drag the continent into war, it all started with Germany's one major objective, to diplomatically box in its old rival, France. And that one goal, man, it was like tipping over the first domino in a very long line.
So what happens next? Well, everyone starts picking teams. This wasn't just about making friends, this was all about security and power. Nations started signing these treaties, making promises, and creating a system that literally split the continent right down the middle.
And here they are, the two big teams that took shape. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And facing off against them was the Triple Entente, France, Great Britain, and Russia. Now, with these lines drawn so clearly, any little dispute involving just one of these countries had the terrifying potential to pull everybody else into the fight.
Okay, so these alliances, they created the structure for a huge conflict. You had the two opposing sides, all lined up. But a structure isn't enough to start a fire, right? You need fuel. You need some real active tension to turn these divisions into something that could actually explode. So let's look at what that fuel was.
And the first big can of gasoline on the fire was nationalism. And we're not just talking about simple patriotism, like loving your country. No, this was a much more aggressive, competitive belief that your nation was destined for greatness, usually at the expense of someone else.
Just look at how these massive powers were squaring off. You had France, still fuming over its defeat in a war with Prussia decades earlier. You had Germany, this new industrial giant, wanting to flex its muscles. Russia saw itself as the great protector of all Slavic peoples. And then there was Austria-Hungary, this creaky old empire just trying to hold itself together. All of these competing dreams were on a collision course.
And this rivalry wasn't just a European squabble. Oh no. It spilled out all over the globe in this frantic, competitive race for colonies. Imperialism, as it was called, became another huge source of conflict.
And the logic behind it was actually pretty simple and super competitive. Step 1, you race to grab territory in Africa and Asia. Step 2, you get access to all their valuable raw materials. And Step 3, you secure new markets where you can sell all the stuff your factories are making. This put the European powers in direct competition with each other in a worldwide game for power and money.
So you've got the alliances, you've got this intense nationalism, and you have all these global rivalries. Where does it all lead? Well, it leads to a pretty logical and frankly terrifying conclusion: militarism. The thinking was simple. If you think your neighbor is getting ready for a fight, well, you'd better get ready too. And that is exactly what happened across Europe.
The perfect example of this is the naval race between Britain and Germany. For Britain, an island with a global empire, its navy was everything. It was their lifeline. So when Germany decided, hey, we're going to build a massive fleet to challenge you, Britain saw that as a direct threat to its very existence. And that escalated tensions like you wouldn't believe.
But it wasn't just happening at sea. On land, a huge arms race kicked off, especially between Germany, France, and Russia. Every country started expanding its army, developing deadlier weapons, and drawing up detailed plans for war. The crazy part is, all this military buildup didn't make anyone feel safer. It just created this continent-wide atmosphere of fear and paranoia. Every move was watched, and every new battleship or rifle was seen as a new threat. So let's take a step back and look at the whole picture. We've seen all the different pieces of the puzzle: the rigid alliances, the aggressive nationalism, the global rivalries, and that frantic arms race. Now let's see how they all click together to make a massive war, not just possible, but, well, almost inevitable.
And here it is, the simple, brutal math of it all. The alliance system meant a tiny spark could ignite a huge fire. Nationalism gave everyone a reason to fight. The rivalries over colonies and markets created constant friction. And the massive armies and navies meant that everybody, and I mean everybody, had their finger on the trigger. All those things together, that's what created the European powder keg.
Which really leaves us with one final, pretty unsettling thought. By building these giant armies and locking themselves into these complex alliances, the great powers of Europe thought they were making themselves safe. But what they accidentally did was build a perfect machine for war. And it just makes you wonder, when everyone is armed to the teeth, organized for battle, and expecting a fight, is peace even really possible?